All right, everyone. The Prime Minister of Belgium resigns as the UN Migration Pact crisis begins to erupt. That is what we'll be talking about. On today's video, I want to give a huge shout out to our brand new viewers. If this is your first time here, I post 2 videos a day, analyzing current events in light of some really awesome conservative trends. So if you would, please smack that bell and subscribe button. As you can see, we are in the final countdown to 100,000 subscribers. It'd be an absolute privilege to have you as one of them. All right, everyone, we have our first casualty of what I'm expecting to be many more over the fallout from the signing of the UN Migration Pact in Morocco a few days back. Belgium's Prime Minister Charles Michel has officially resigned after he came home to a vote of no confidence in his parliament. Now, I'm sure many of you know that in the weeks leading up to the official signing of the pact, Belgium was in the midst of very, very heated battle in their parliament over whether to sign the UN Pact that many believe rightly, in my opinion, will in fact turn migration to a human right that would then be forced down the throats of nations as it's enforced by international human rights courts. It's basically a transnational open borders agreement, and that's why over 20 nations refused to sign it, including here in the States, Russia, Brazil, virtually the whole of Central and Eastern Europe, Japan, Korea, China, and the like. But unfortunately, Belgium was one of the nations that did sign the pact. Now, what you have to understand is that Belgium is currently being led by the New Flemish Alliance, which is usually abbreviated as NVA. The New Flemish Alliance is the largest member of Belgium's right-wing coalition. They're a thoroughly nationalist populist group. But they left the government in order to protest this prime minister there, Charles Michel, when he decided to betray the alliance and sign the UN Migration Pact. And as a result, the New Flemish Alliance did 2 things in response. First, they effectively organized thousands upon thousands of protesters show up in Brussels to protest the UN Migration Pact just this past Sunday, right in front of the headquarters of the European Union. And second, they joined together with the left-wing parties there in Belgium to call for a vote of no confidence against this prime minister, which provoked his resignation, which he handed to King Philippe, who's the head of the Belgian state. Now, the Nationalist Populist New Flemish Alliance had already abandoned Michel after he said he was going to sign the agreement. And so Michel represents more the center of the center-right coalition, of which the Nationalist Flemish Alliance is the majority. And so when they abandoned him and broke off their coalition, if you can believe it, Michel actually went to the left-wing parties and asked to form a coalition with them, very similar to what Angela Merkel did with the Social Democrats in Germany. Again, virtually all of the surveys and polls that have been taken over the last few years indicate that the various populations within Europe see absolutely no difference whatsoever between the center-left and the center-right political parties. They're basically one big party, and they're right. The actions of this Belgian prime minister absolutely corroborated such sentiments. Now, political scholars are recognizing here that this resignation is but the latest example of the collapse of the political center in Europe. We've talked about this on a number of our other videos. The European political center has all but completely collapsed of late. I mentioned I think it was just our other video just the other day, of the 946 European districts that held elections in 2017, the center-left suffered losses in an astonishing 94% of those districts. 94% of European districts voted against the center-left in a single year alone. That's how bad it is for the center-left in Europe right now. Again, the New York Times recognized that in many places in Europe, the center-left has actually gone extinct. It just no longer exists. One of the major nationalist right parties in Belgium, what's known as Vlaams Belang, they declared that the prime minister's resignation was indeed a victory for nationalist populists across Europe. And I think they're absolutely right. Again, we just saw a major demonstration outside the headquarters of the EU in Brussels. Police actually were deploying tear gas, water cannons. I mentioned the other day, you could see video of water cannons basically, dispersing people away from the EU's institutional headquarters. And as I understand it, well over 100 people were arrested. But you can't arrest the continent as much as globalist elites may want to try. The simple fact of the matter is that every major study undertaken on the European population over the last 4 years reveals that immigration is the number one concern among the European electorate. The recent poll taken by YouGov asked voters across Europe what were their top 2 political priorities, what were the top 2 issues concerning them most as voters. And astonishingly, the answers to that question were exactly the same in every single state: immigration and terrorism. Only Italy differed from this. Italians had a slightly different answer. Italians said immigration and unemployment, okay? But every single nation agreed that immigration was the number one issue of concern for European voters. Now, despite the preponderance of evidence over the last 4 years, our globalist elite continue to believe that the fundamental cause of this collapse of the political center and the rise of the nationalist populace is purely economic. They think, in fact, everything can be reduced to economic. I mean, this is the consequence of Marxist and globalist commitments, the miscalculation that everything can be diagnosed and resolved through the lens of economics. But as these studies have conclusively demonstrated, what's really operative here, what's really at issue among European citizens, is the dominant concern over culture. The left believe that economic hardship and austerity measures on the one hand, and economic inequalities and the lack of opportunities and inordinate material distributions on the other, have been the cause of this mass dissatisfaction with the political center. But again, many of the so-called far-right parties throughout Europe began in the 1980s. That's where they started, long before austerity measures were imposed or mass economic hardships began to surface, which was during the late 2000s. In fact, the nationalist right really began to emerge in places like Austria and the Netherlands during periods of unparalleled economic prosperity. And they began to form coalition governments all the way back in 2000, 2002, long before austerity and economic downturns were factors. Moreover, here in the United States, studies have found that those who were most concerned about economic issues, like economic disparities and so on, those people voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. Those who were in poor financial shape were disproportionately more likely to vote, in our case, for the Democratic candidate, who, of course, ended up losing quite overwhelmingly, I might add, in terms of the Electoral College. Remember, Trump is the first Republican candidate to break over 300 electoral votes since 1988. So those who've been concerned solely about economics, they tend to actually embrace the center left. What we found in terms of studies is that general concerns about economic disparity, they're just not reliable indicators for how people vote. What we are finding absolutely is a reliable indicator is the level of insecurity that people feel about their own culture and their own sense of national identity. That appears almost absolute in terms of voting patterns. Those with deep-seated anxieties about immigration, national identity, overwhelmingly have begun to turn to the nationalist populace. Right, cultural concerns and cultural anxieties are emerging as clear, reliable indicators of voting patterns among the European and American electorates. And we can see this particularly in a 2017 Ipsos Mori poll that surveyed nearly 18,000 voters in 25 countries. Very impressive sampling. Found that 43% of British, 54% of Hungarians, 63% of Italians, we could keep going and going, believed, and I'm quoting here, that immigration is causing my country to change in ways that I do not like, close quote. We're talking a clear majority of Europeans believe that immigration is adversely affecting their continent and their respective cultures, which just underscores the absolute arrogance and disdain that our globalist elite have for our citizens, for their citizens that they merely claim to represent. Well, it appears that those citizens are the ones that are ready to have the last laugh here. Anger and outrage over the UN Migration Pact has begun to erupt, claiming its first victim and the resignation of the Belgian Prime Minister. And if these trends over the last few years are any indicator, he will not be the last. As always, please like, comment, and subscribe. Check out our new online merchandise selection where you can get gear and apparel celebrating all things nationalist and populist, and a special Christmas time discount of 15% off all items by entering the promotion code below. And if you would, please click either on our Patreon subscribe star or PayPal links below and become a supporter of this channel. As you know, we are periodically demonetized by YouTube, and we could really use your help so we can continue to analyze current events in light of awesome conservative trends so that you can personally and professionally flourish. God bless.